Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the open meeting of the Coastal Resilience Advisory Committee being conducted remotely pursuant to Chapter 20 of the Acts of 2021 and being held by video conference. Please note this meeting is being recorded and all attendees are participating via the Zoom app as posted on the town's website, identifying how the public may join. The public is encouraged to follow along using the posted agenda unless the chair notes otherwise. All supporting materials that have been provided to members of this body are available on the town's website unless otherwise noted. Please be aware that other people may be able to see you and take care not to share your device's screen. Anything you broadcast may be captured by the recording. Please silence all phones and devices. Members of the public wishing to participate in the meeting must use their full name for Zoom access. If full names are not used, people will not be allowed to participate in the discussion. Okay, the town reserves the right to remove any member of the public from the meeting who doesn't use a full name or who acts inappropriately. Ensuring public access does not ensure public participation unless such participation is required by law. This meeting will feature public comment. Permit me to confirm that all members and persons anticipated on the agenda are present and can hear me. I am Mary Longacre, Chair of the Coastal Resilience Advisory Committee. Members, when I call your name, please respond in the affirmative, and note that I will be introducing everyone with their affiliation because we do have a number of guests and a number of invited speakers. So Gary Beller, who is our representative from the town's Advisory Committee of Non-Voting Taxpayers.
Present.
Sarah Boyce is not present today. Peter Brace, who is our representative from the Harbor and Shellfish Advisory Board.
Here.
Matt Fee is our representative from the Select Board, and I'll note that Matt is also a member of the Nantucket Planning and Economic Development Commission.
Here.
Ian Golding is our representative from the Conservation Commission.
Here.
Jen Carberg is not here today. Fritz McClure is our representative from the Planning Board and is also a member of the Nantucket Planning and Economic Development Commission.
Here.
Joanna Roach is a member at large.
Here.
And Joanna, you're also a member of the Finance Committee, if memory serves me correctly.
That is correct.
Right. Okay. Staff, when I call you, I introduced myself. I want to mention that I'm, in addition to being chair of this committee, I'm also vice chair of the Nantucket Planning and Economic Development Commission. I'll note we have 4 members of the NP and EDC in attendance, but that does not represent a quorum. Staff, when I call your name, please respond in the affirmative. Vince Murphy.
Here. Thank you. Good morning.
Yeah. And observing with Vince, we also have Morgan Sale, our Coastal Resources Technician. I apologize, Vince, you're the Coastal Resource Coordinator, Coastal Resilience Coordinator. I forgot to introduce you. Do we have Chuck Larson here, the town Special Project Manager?
Here.
And let's see, this is going to take me a little bit to get caught up. We have 32 participants. So if I forget somebody, please let me know. Do we have Andrew Vorst here? Or Leslie Snell? I'm not sure if they were able to attend. And do we have Holly Backus?
Present.
Thank you, Holly. We have Allison Mitchell from the town's Real Estate and Housing Office.
Here.
Thank you, Allison. Are there other members of staff present? Again, I apologize. There are more people here than I can see on the screen. So doing a quick run through, I don't see other town staff members. We have, as guests invited to speak today, members of the Steamship Authority. We have Bob Davis, who is the General Manager of the Steamship Authority.
Good morning.
Thank you, Bob. We have Rob Rennie, who is Nantucket's representative to the Steamship Board of Directors and also serves on the Roads and Right-of-Way Committee, and I believe is also the town assessor. Do I have that right, Rob?
Yeah, that pretty much covers it.
Okay, thank you, Rob. And we have Nat Lowell, who is Nantucket's representative to the Steamship Port Council, and I'll note also a member, also the chair of the Nantucket Planning and Economic Development Commission and a member of the Roads and Right-of-Way Commission. Nat?
Thank you, Mary. Yes, correct.
Did I miss any affiliations there, Nat?
I'll just leave the rest out.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. So I think that concludes people who are invited to present on today's agenda. Did I miss anyone? I don't think so. Okay. Before we turn to the first item on the agenda, permit me to cover some ground rules for effective and clear conduct of our business and to ensure accurate meeting minutes. The chair will introduce each speaker on the agenda. After they conclude their remarks, the chair will go down the list of members, inviting each by name to provide any comment, questions, or motions. Please hold until your name is called. Further, please remember to mute yourself on your phone or computer when you're not speaking. For any response, please wait until the chair yields the floor to you and state your name before speaking. If members wish to engage in a conversation with other members, please do so through the chair, taking care to identify yourself. And for items with public comment, after members have spoken, the chair will afford public comment to those members of the public who have joined the meeting via Zoom. Members of the public who wish to speak must state their names and be acknowledged by and speak through the chair. If you're not able to participate in the remote meeting, you may also submit comments to the Coastal Resilience Coordinator, Vince Murphy, to be read into the meeting record. His email is vmurphy@nantucket-ma.gov. And finally, each vote taken in this meeting will be conducted by roll call vote. Because we do have a number of guests here today, I want to provide a little background before we move to our first agenda topic. With the acceptance of the Coastal Resilience Plan by the Select Board on January 12th, we can move forward with the final part of the consulting contract for the plan, which is to use the remaining funds to pay Arcadis to assist with developing a grant, excuse me, a grant application as was authorized by the Select Board on September 8th. At its last meeting, the Coastal Resilience Advisory Committee voted unanimously to seek a grant to begin on the Coastal Resilience Plan recommendation 2-6, which is a feasibility and design study for the downtown neighborhood flood barrier phase 1 project. That is the Easy Street section from Strait Wharf to Steamboat Wharf, where we're currently experiencing sunny day, high tide flooding, even without wind or rain impact. Note that the Coastal Resilience Plan also calls for this project to be coordinated with recommendation 2-1, which is Steamboat Wharf Resilience. The purpose of our meeting is to bring together some of the most directly involved parties so that we can make our interests known to each other. Our goal with the Coastal Resilience Advisory Committee is to make sure that our recommendations take into consideration initiatives that may already be underway or planned by other parts of the town by private organizations, and further to assist those groups with whatever resources and expertise we may have. The first item on our agenda is a presentation from Chuck Larson on his Easy Street flooding analysis. Copies of that were included in the meeting agenda notice. Chuck, would you like to go ahead?
Yes, thank you. So let's make sure we got things working here. Is that visible on your end?
Yes, looks great.
Okay, thank you, Madam Chair, and good morning, everyone. I appreciate the opportunity. It's really great to see everyone. Today's presentation started with a phone call from Vince in December, asking if I had done any work to update the 2019 Easy Street analysis, and if I had looked at sea level rise impacts. I replied, generally, yes, I've been doing bits and pieces, not really anything cohesively, but I could take, some time over the holiday break and resurrect it and, put something together. So I expect most, if not all of the committee has seen, some of my previous work that was made in presentations in 2019, 2020. You have a couple of handouts that summarize that. And the 2-pager that I had provided to Vince in January. So, the last 2 weeks, this presentation has taken a life of its own. And it was really great that we had today as a date that was a self-imposed deadline because, I was able to really, put together something I'm really excited about. So I have a presentation and I feel bad. I haven't shared it with Vince and I haven't shared it with Mary. And I always like to try to have, a presentation reviewed by others before going to a larger audience. But I think I'm okay in this case. And sadly, I've got 24 slides and I'm going to have to go fast for some of them. And that, that'll be fine, but you'll know they're there and we can come back and talk about them or ask questions about them as needed. And this is something that I think can actually be developed into a technical paper. But enough said, let me get started. So today's presentation, we pretty much teed it up, talking about Easy Street high tide flooding, updated the 2019 data set that I had to include 2 additional years. So I have 1980 through 2021. I also added the references to future water levels from the Noaa sea level rise scenarios. But what's also new information, at least for me, and new learning, was some research that was done at the University of Hawaii and with NASA and Noaa, developing a NASA flooding days projection tool. And I've got some setups that I ran for Easy Street. And then of course, laying out, the findings and the results, and that's still, work in progress. High tide flooding, I think we're all familiar with it, but it's water that is pretty much that shows up, that spills into the area. It's sunny day flooding, nuisance flooding. It's not your, high severity storm driven flooding. It's the cumulative flooding that tends to occur with higher than usual high tides. And Noaa has a specific definition of what they call nuisance flooding, tied to a particular threshold, a particular depth of water represented by mean higher high water. And that is an approach that was nationally calibrated for consistency across all areas, all tide gauges. So that number is a useful benchmark for us. It's also the nuisance flooding is also it represents what they call minor flooding as well. And then you also have moderate and major levels of flooding as well, defined by Noaa, and 2.7 feet and 4 feet above mean higher water as well. And so coastal waters are a reference to a tidal datum. I'm not going to go into any detail here, but other than say, water levels are observed and measured with datums. They require a lot of care when converting and when using this information. I have found errors in a consultant's report, and believe it or not, I even found an error on the Noaa website for our tide gauge, which they since corrected. So it's easy to make mistakes, but you got to pay attention to this because the elevations do matter, and it's easy to mix numbers. So the impacts from high tide flooding. Well, I think the setting, as everybody knows, it's a critical route for goods and services on Nantucket. It's a major corridor for trucks, cars, pedestrians, and bicycles, and tourists. And it provides that view shed of Nantucket Harbor. It's really the front door, of Nantucket to the world. So a little bit of history. Bulkhead was rebuilt in 2017, increased in additional elevation. The storm drains at the bulkhead were fitted with backflow prevention valves to minimize this type of high tide flooding, but they're having challenges. That's a story for another day. And the bottom line is that we've been observing increased amounts of roadway flooding at some high tides. So this is what I documented and presented in 2019, 2020, pretty much photographic records tied to the tide gauge records, and also looking at previous amounts of rainfall to understand if any of that would be a potential influence for water level showing up on the roadway, and it was not. And then I looked at the frequency of occurrence for data from 1980 through 2019, and that's the information that was shared previously. And this became a curiosity. How often is this occurring? And it was just a great opportunity. Tide gauge and observations and documentation of flooding. It's a perfect project. So one type of nuisance flooding on Easy Street is water that begins to cover the road, and that's identified at mean higher high water of about 1.1 feet. There's a catch basin at the intersection with Oak Street, that's at approximately 0.90 mean higher high water, and that's been verified by survey. So from there we can pretty much calibrate the depth of water, and then also, of course, using the time as it's stamped to the water levels on the time gauge. And at this point, it doesn't look like much, but hey, I think there is some inconvenience to vehicles, bicycles, scooters, trucks. The crosswalk there at Oak Street is submerged, needing to walk around. And you'll also see in the photograph that at this level, water begins to start appearing on the lower Broad Street. I will point out that these are two different drainage systems, two different outfalls. So fixing, the Easy Street outfall will not necessarily cure the solution here for lower Broad Street, but that's, again, I'll talk about that more at a later date. So here's the latest data, 20 and 21 included. And what's most interesting to me is just looking at the 10-year moving averages of the events. And you notice that there is a fair amount of fluctuation, and that in 2021, we had 56 days per year at a water level at or above 1.1 feet mean higher high water. And that actually ties with the value recorded for 2010. So it's a maximum. I think, it's interesting to, again, observe the progression as we go forward. I also did some work to try to identify where in the data sets I might be missing data. And that information has been identified, and those bars that have an asterisk above them are years where we don't have complete data from the tide gauge for whatever reason. So it's possible that those number of events is underreported. Yeah, maybe that explains something of what we're seeing in 2015, maybe not. But I think one of the things I'd like to try to do is to try to tie this into what months were impacted to see if it was, during the cycle, the season that we tend to have higher high tides. So going the next step was to extend this information to the Noaa sea level rise scenarios. So that's what's shown in this graph. The bars to the right are the 2030 and 2040 projected mean higher high water tides, and the elevation, 1.1, 1.28 feet, respectively, for the intermediate high and the intermediate scenario, close to 1.1, a little higher, but I think they, provide hold to begin talking about this. And I had these results actually last year, and I was uncomfortable. It just seemed like a huge extreme, a huge step from 2020 to 2030 or 2040. And I was reconciling with that. It looks like it's possible, but is it realistic? So I can tell you, I can say I'm changing my mind, thinking that it is. So that's where this second set of information comes in, which is the model developed at the University of Hawaii along with NASA, Noaa, and others. And it's an online tool that allows us to model high tide, high water level floodings out to 2100, along with the selected climate scenarios and selected elevations. And by good fortune, Nantucket having a tide gauge, was included in this study. So we're very fortunate for that. So I found this very interesting, and I hadn't read much on the methodology until I found this report from Thompson in 2019, which lays out a lot of the technical details, and the schematic on the right. I'm not going to go through it, but there are several steps. It is a rather sophisticated model. So here's the user interface, cut and pasted to fit on a slide. You're able to select a location. You're able to take a look at the water levels for minor and moderate Noaa classified flooding. Plus, you have the ability to choose something above and below those as well. So I was able to dial in 13 inches above mean high water, which is about 1.1 feet. And I said, all right, well, what do the results look like? You can see that there are 3 scenarios, sea level rise scenarios identified. The orange is the middle one there, which is the Noaa intermediate. And then above and below that, you have the intermediate low and intermediate high. This is the same graph, just at a larger scale, so you can take a look at it, and using the user interface, you can actually hover over and determine the numbers and then the range, for these areas. So what was reported in this tool is, 191 flooding days per year on average in 2030 at 1.1 feet or 1 to 2 inches of water on Easy Street at Oak Street. And it was like, maybe it's confirmation bias, maybe, but I'll explain a little bit more about that. But, it did seem that, okay, the trend seems similar. This is kind of the trend that, I've been noticing early into the 2020s. And, it does seem plausible that, something like this could be going on. And so at 180 days, that's every other high tide, higher high tide causing flooding. But we'll just kind of take this, put it to the side, and want to give you a little bit of background here, not to bore you to death with probability and modeling, but so this is a probability distribution curve of mean high water. This is for Norfolk, Virginia, and water levels range from high to low, and there's a central tendency at the top of the blue curve. It's your normal shaped bell curve. The dashed blue line is data that was assembled for the 1950s, as shown, and subsequently the solid blue line is data from the 2000s. What's interesting is that as mean sea level rise, that curve shifts to the right. And that is important because the tail of the curve is what's really interesting in this situation. And it's in this tail of the curve that you have those rare exceedances of high water as part of your tide forces, your tide cycle. So you can identify a nuisance level, tied to an elevation, and examine that along with this. And what you find is, where that red line intersects the blue curve. And you'll note the differences in time, and that most recently, you're on the part of the curve that is really starting to grow exponentially. And things change rapidly from that point. And you're seeing the same thing in the cumulative probability model here too, but it's really that point in the curve there that matters. And then what happens out through here as the curve starts to really steepen. And it's really the increasing number of events that happen because of that. And So, that's what the researchers have identified as a point of inflection in the analysis. And that, for me, that was kind of a wow moment. That added some credibility to some of the reading I was doing, and it really seemed to make sense in terms of how tides behave over time. So in terms of the year of inflection for the Noaa flooding thresholds, and they only have that information for the Noaa flooding thresholds, the 2 thresholds. But you'll note that for Nantucket, it's listed as 2033 as the year at which that acceleration would begin and continue for about a decade. And what's also remarkable is that the particular sea level rise scenario really is not, impacting. So if you're thinking, the rate of growth of, sea level rise is lower or higher, it doesn't seem to be sensitive to that. It does in terms of the number of days that'll be impacted, but the fact that that'll be occurring, accelerating in 2033 for Nantucket, I think is a pretty interesting finding. And of course, you can look at any other information that they have for other tide gauges, and you'll do note that there are differences. Woods Hole is, 5 years earlier, and then, 2023 for Boston. Yeah, interesting information. So that's available for our use. So sticking with the Noaa minor flooding, or what they also call high tide flooding, what are the number of days per year on average that we have that, and understanding that that'll be about 8 to 10 inches or more water depth at Easy Street and Oak Street. And so these are the numbers from the model for 2030, 2040, 2050. We do see things, tend to progress gradually, but then do tend to accelerate, into the 2040s and then into 2050. And so this is a frequency, days per year on average that will have 8 to 10 inches of water covering that lower portion of Easy Street. Very, very valuable, very easy to use tool. So I'm down to my last 6 slides, so I hope I'm doing okay on time. But yeah, I wanted to bounce this off the, what's provided in the Nantucket CRP. I have to admit that I didn't necessarily read it as closely as I could have during the review process, but I did go back to it and go through it to look up information as it pertained to this particular matter. And there's information provided. They state that they're recommending the use of a value called the mean monthly high water as the tidal representative of nuisance flooding. And I'll show a little bit about that. But what's interesting is that level, that water level, is correlated roughly to exceedances on an annual basis of 25 to 35 times a year, and is intended as somewhat of a tipping point. So this was a new concept to me. So I did some digging using the research and references that were in the back of the new Coastal Resilience Guide, and kind of set it up like this. You've got MMHW, you have MHHW. And for somebody like me that's just a little bit dyslexic, boy, that can get, got to focus hard on that. But so in terms of the mean monthly high water, intended for monthly flooding events, more or less, and that's why it's in quotations. Mean higher high water is really more representative of what occurs on a daily level, daily flooding events. And the number of exceedances, as I mentioned before, and with mean higher high water, you have exceedances of that water level hundreds of times a year. And so the mean the monthly mean higher water is the average of the highest monthly tide levels across a defined time period. And that's as they present it in the CRP. Whereas the mean, I'm going to get myself in trouble. The mean high water is a site-specific datum used by Noaa, established by Noaa. It's tied to a specific 19-year tidal epoch. So there are, some differences there in terms of how, the information, the tide elevation information is used. I just found it interesting that it was the number of 30, floods per year that is hypothesized as being the possible tipping point for livability. And I don't know whether that's right or wrong, but I think that's how this is kind of founded or put together. So I wanted to take a look at, well, what does that look like on Easy Street? I didn't put a lot of effort into this. I looked at 1 year's worth of tide data, 12 months. And I went through and using the data in the spreadsheets, I was able to identify the highest high water for each month, and essentially do a simple average. And that comes out to about 1.5 feet above mean high water. So interesting. It's just a little bit below the minor flooding threshold by Noaa, and and I kind of just quickly overlaid that elevation on the graph here, and you can see that 25 to 35 times a year seems to make sense. And I think the key thing, understanding this as a new reference point, is that elevations below the monthly mean higher water flood more frequently. So some thoughts about flooding frequency, and then I have 2 slides to wrap up. So flooding frequency, I think that's an important point. It's referenced to different ways in different literature. I think that it's important that it needs to consider the tidal flooding. It really needs to be tied to what's the impact, where the infrastructure sits, how it's affected, and really more importantly, how is it impacting the community and business and life on an ongoing basis. And 30 tidal floods per year were hypothesized as one kind of tipping point in terms of starting to take action. That was adopted by New York City and others, and it's recommended in our CRP. There are other cities that probably take a more conservative approach, looking at 5 to 10 days of flooding per year. And I think careful consideration is needed when using this to trigger action. Closing thoughts. I tried to get this down to 1 page, and I just couldn't. I apologize, but I'll try to go through the highlights. Easy Street, we talked about. Certainly what we're seeing with high tide flooding, it's increasing such that in 2030, 2040, you'll be seeing that 1 to 2 inches of nuisance flooding on average every other day. Looked at the NASA tool, flooding days projection tool. I think the biggest takeaway, besides there was some confirmation to the analysis I had done with the Noaa tide data, was really this concept of high tide frequency will not be incremental, but in coming decades it will include inflections, and that that changes the rate of increase. And one thing I did not bring out, but it's available in the research, is the point that the high tide flooding events will tend to cluster by months and years. So there's the granularity of the data that you could actually map it out at a monthly level based on the forecasting with the model may be useful in terms of timing. And important to know, inflections are specific to a tide gauge location, sea level rise scenario, and flooding threshold. And so with Nantucket's 1 to 2 inches of water on Easy Street, I would suggest we're probably at that point of inflection where things are really starting to break and steepen in terms of the amount of change. A few thoughts on the Noaa's nuisance flooding, same as Noaa minor flooding. So that's a number that was established for consistency across the US. That's at 1.8 feet mean high water. And in 2040, that's projected to occur about 100 times a year. And for that 1.8 feet of water level, the year of inflection is identified as 2033 in the tool. And at that point, you do get the accelerated change in water levels. And that produces that water level is a depth of approximately 10 inches on Easy Street and Oak Street. So I think, there's a couple of approaches to, identify, well, what is nuisance flooding, how frequent, and things like that. Just a side note, just editorial, it could be confusing for some, just helping to distinguish, monthly mean high water and, mean high water. It's almost, when I was reading it, I thought it was a typo, but, maybe there's a different way that can be, kind of put together. And again, thinking about, thresholds and frequencies for flooding. And it seems logical that, some of the locations that have a lower number, are also building in additional time for planning, permitting, design, construction, getting the thing off the ground. So it's a matter of how much warning, do you need in advance? And with that, I'm going to leave you with this picture, which is work in progress, trying to help visualize the different water levels on Easy Street and what's occurring and what will be occurring over time. This may, be helpful, going forward. I will note that the mean monthly high water is identified, for this as well, along with, the mean high water datum and the Noaa definitions and what constitutes flooding on Easy Street. And in the case of Easy Street, it is high water that backflows into the storm drain, comes up through the catch basin, and then just starts to spill onto the surface of the road. And at elevation 1.1 feet higher, mean high water, that's where you tend to have, the 1 to 2 inches of water. And currently at about 50 times a year and will grow. So with that, I would like to hit the pause button. I'd love any comments, questions, ideas about this. I hope it's helpful. I hope it's not too much information for one presentation, but I appreciate your time and the opportunity to share it.
Well, thank you very much, Chuck. I think it's wonderful that you took the various sources and were able to tie them together in a comprehensive way and found that they corroborate each other. And thank you for presenting this. I think it's great information. I want to make a note that this is just part of the situation at Easy Street. This is tidal effects only. This is not storm effects. This is not rainfall coming down through the storm sewers. This is not subsidence of the land due to it being on fill. So there are a lot more factors affecting the situation on Easy Street. But I think we can see just the tidal factors alone are significant and a cause for concern. Do we have questions or comments from committee members at this time? And if I'm not seeing you because I have now 39 participants, please just go ahead and let me know.
Here, I have a quick question.
Yes, ma'am.
Chuck, why in year 2050, 2060 did there's the three lines all flatten out, the low, medium, and high? Are they assuming we're gonna, that things are gonna get better? We're gonna take care of it, or?
Well, it flattens out as you approach 365 days, right? And you then go underwater essentially all the time. And so you follow the shape of that curve, and you've got that point of inflection. Things are really steep, but then as you go to the crest of the curve, it starts to slow down again. And then from that point, it'll be underwater, most, if not all the time. But you're talking, decades.
Thank you, Chuck. Other questions or comments? Okay, Vince?
Thanks, Mary. So Chuck picked up on a pretty significant difference between this study and the CRP, the difference between the mean monthly high water and the mean higher high water. I just wanted to kind of clarify that one just a little bit, if I could, for Chuck as much as for everybody else. The CRP was a large document and took many months and had many different study areas all around the island. And we felt that if we wanted to apply mean higher high water, as Chuck did around the entire island, we didn't have enough money, time, or resources. So that's why we took a much higher level type of data, just looking at once per month, sorry, the cumulative per month, the monthly mean high water. I'm doing the same as Chuck, confused me to them a little bit, I'm sorry. But that was the reason so that if we had to, we could apply it evenly across the whole island and not destroy the budget on the CRP.
So if I understand correctly, you were trying to identify that point at which, you have high tide flooding.
Correct.
Well, I guess what I'm suggesting is tied to whatever datum you want to use. And for Easy Street, for the type of high tide flooding I was showing, that was 1.1 feet mean higher high water. Maybe for Easton Street, that'll be, some other bigger number. And then Washington Street will be a different number. But, I think how we identify that number, and then I think what you're, trying to propose is a way to name it so that people can kind of easily, visualize it. I think that makes sense, but I don't think there's one number, that should apply everywhere, because you got to look at the criticality of the location, the impacts, things like that. As a first start, sure, mean monthly high water is not a bad place to start. But Easy Street is way beyond that, in terms of a trigger.
Correct. So just to follow on, if I might, Mary.
Yep.
So yeah, this information that Chuck is presenting here today fills this massive knowledge gap, and I'm hopeful that we might be able to do similar studies to this for other areas, maybe Washington Street next, I don't know. That's kind of for Chuck to decide if he even has time for that start. But then there's another question. I saw you presented all of 2021, I think was the year you used. That was really cool. So I have a background in population ecology, and I like to look for clusters. Clusters and data are always the interesting bit, and you called it out yourself. So there's going to be consecutive events, so many high tides in a row. And one of the things that when I look at clusters, is there any trend in the clusters? Is there a seasonal effect, or so more flooding events in winter at the moment from the historic data? And you could expect more effects in future winters. I'm looking at much more smaller subsets, I have to say here. And it seems like there's also kind of a September, October type effect as well, kind of lining up with hurricane season to some extent. Do you think that's right?
So there is a plot that kind of helps lay out, what the history has shown for things like that. But you also bring up an interesting point. Right now, we're just counting the number of events. And that is, at least 1 hour, there was a reading at or above that threshold. There's work that's going on now to go to the next level is what's the duration? Because for a lot of the analysis I did, that you'd have 1 day and you'd have multiple hours, for the more significant storms where, you'd have higher water levels. So you could also look at the duration of flooding as another way of measuring that. And, I think we'll probably be seeing people do more of that. This, research that was done with Hawaii, references going to that level of detail, but that's just a whole nother level of, data crunching.
Great. Thank you, Vince and Chuck, for that. Further questions or comments? Gary?
Yes, Chuck, I have one question about your final slide. I'm not sure I understand how the storm drain system works. When the high tide comes, does the water come through the storm drain and then come into Easy Street? Or is it, if it's high tide, the water is coming over the piers that we have? Yeah.
Yeah, so what's happening, there are backflow valves that have been installed at the end of the pipes here that are intended to close, when the water rises, and that is supposed to stop. But what's happening is you get to the water level elevation of the harbor matching the elevation on the road, and we're finding that water is backflowing and rises, to its level of repose, which is essentially, begins spilling onto Easy Street. So there is work to, kind of repair, replace, try a different type of backflow valve, but, those are, they're not a permanent solution. They might help short term, but, as water levels increase, the amount of back pressure increases in the valves, do tend to be less effective. For the flooding on Lower Broad Street, there's an outfall, that's an outfall that goes through and is on the side of the steamship, and that has no backflow prevention devices. And so we're looking at that as well. But we're going to wait to try to install this new device here to see if it makes sense for something like that over there toward the Lower Broad Street drainage.
But Chuck, that brings up a question in my mind. If we were able to just build a little 3-inch wall around the storm drain itself, just thinking of the smallest possible intervention, would that help prevent water from coming out of the storm drain onto the street? It might make the storm drain, non-functional for storms, but
right.
Just
Yeah, so
kind
you're
of-
thinking like sandbagging, right? Sandbagging around the storm drain. I hadn't thought of that, but there is some, I think that would work in some cases until the water level gets to, a point that, the sandbags are no longer effective. But yeah, that's the kind of creative thinking we're going to need to kind of address this in the short term.
So maybe some deployable donuts or something like that to isolate those drains. Gary, you have a follow-up?
Yeah, but also that also means perhaps that when the water levels are, the high tide is so high as to cause the backup of the storm drain, it means that basically if there happens to be any storms or rain that is normally coming to go out through the storm drain, that's going to cause complete backup all over the island where those storm drains are supposed to be taking the water out. And so all the neighborhoods will now be feeling the result of that because the storm drain will be ineffective to take away the water that's coming out of the sky.
So, right. So yeah, not necessarily a good solution for non-sunny day or storm flooding. So, but that's the right point.
Yep.
Peter, did you have a comment as well? No, okay. Vince, you had a hand up.
just to very simply say, I'm going to present information on this very situation later, based on the flooding we had on Martin Luther King Day.
And so I wanted to note, we had 3 days of flooding over the New Year's weekend. We had 2 days of flooding over the Martin Luther King holiday weekend, and we're anticipating a storm with the potential for flooding coming up this weekend. If that gives us 1 or 2 days, we'll be at nearly a week in January where we experience flooding on Easy Street. So that's pretty significant, although thankfully it is January and not July. Any further comments or questions on this presentation? Okay, if not, I want to note that I made a grave error and skipped the approval of the minutes at the beginning of the meeting. That was the first item on the agenda. My apologies. I hope that no one is going to hang me out to dry for that. With everyone's permission, can we just move that to following public comment and proceed now with the discussion of the steamship and the objections to that plan? All right, seeing none. So we have invited the Steamship Authority representatives to see this presentation on Easy Street, but also to tell us how they are planning to deal with sea level rise and climate change in general on Nantucket, but also possibly in other areas where Nantucket would be impacted. Hyannis service, obviously we can't run a boat if Hyannis has a problem. So can I recognize Bob Davis, or Bob, if you have somebody else who you would like to speak, please let us know.
Well, I'll defer to Rob and Nat if they would like to add anything, but I think in terms of a general discussion regarding what are our plans for the Nantucket terminal, we're in the midst of the rebuilding of our Woods Hole facility, so that's kind of stretching our resources at the moment. We have the shoreside, and that project included rebuilding the slips. We took into account projected sea level rises. We're a waterborne transportation agency, as you know, so we have to be on in the harbor there. The facility in Woods Hole, the bulkhead was raised approximately 6 feet from the previous elevation. The terminal building itself is going to end up being raised an additional 6 to 7 feet above that elevation as well, on a plaza, and that's provided we get a variance from the state building inspector to be 4 feet below the flood zone. To do that, we're making the building a stone building, and all the openings are going to have a deployable flood barrier system, so that way if we have any storms coming through. So the process that we went through in terms of Woods Hole, I think, will serve as a good blueprint for the Nantucket terminal, which would be the next facility that we'd be looking at in terms of the rotation of the facilities that we have. You're, I'm sure, all well aware that the Nantucket terminal was rebuilt in the early 80s. So it's coming up on 50 years of service. We'll have to be looking at obviously the sea level rise and resiliency, but the infrastructure itself there, the bulkhead is getting to the point where it'll be better to redo it as opposed to just to patch it up. So obviously the Easy Street entrance to our property is critical concern in terms of it does us no good if we're an island and no one can get to us there. And I know you're all aware of the importance of the heavy lift that we do in terms of supplies and goods goods that the island needs. So we'd be obviously very interested in how to coordinate that along with whatever project is going to needed to be done along the Easy Street bulkhead, and so
Thank you, Bob. Rob or Nat, did you want to add anything? Rob?
I want to thank Chuck for his presentation. I thought that was fantastic. A lot of that stuff I sort of knew in my head, but it's interesting to see it presented the way you did. I thought that was great. And I would just echo things that Bob Davis said. This is obviously a concern going forward. It's something that's constantly being studied and looked at. One of the questions that I have, or possible suggestions, I guess, was you mentioned the outfall along the lower end of Broad, which is, I think, it comes out under the yacht club, I think. So there's a couple of backflow preventer things there, I think, or maybe not. And I've talked to in the past Harvey Young at Young's Bicycle Shop, who's convinced that water is coming through there and up into the street. So that's something that I'm sure we should look at. But I just wanted to thank you for your presentation, Chuck. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rob. Nat, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
There we go. Thank you, Mary, for this. Thank you, everyone, for inviting us. I think that, the other day you and I talked about the land bank project and sort of how all of a sudden everyone can sort of see the future. You know what I mean? Like when that was just the way it was 3 years ago, 4 years ago, it was hard to vision it. Now all of a sudden you see the future walk, pier, whatever you want to call it, dock. I don't want to say dock, but walking, pedestrian access to steamship. You can vision all this. And as far as the terminal goes, 1983, that was built, like Bob said, that there's a lot of, there's some issues with the sheet pile and of course the barging and the work that goes on down there is sort of not designed for all that. At the time that was built, we were just getting off of dolly freight. It's hard to imagine that today, but that's the truth. Anderson Pierce, unbelievable. Matt remembers that. So I think that with the work that's happened on Easy Street combined with whatever the future brings for what the steamship needs as far as the mechanics of it, the actual operation, the flow, do we have a slip? There was something in the harbor plan. This is back whenever that was when Flint was alive. That was quite some time ago. But there was a discussion about, there's something in there about an emergency sort of way that if there was a sinking boat, or like that happened to Victor with a barge once, the barge started to take on water, a place to tie up something really quick. That's all these little pieces are going to be part of the future of the steamship dock reconstruction, whether it be I call it a quarter of a slip, something for barges, something for the modulars to make it easier for them to traverse off of a barge. In the event of the High Line having an interruption where they could dock at our slip without affecting the schedule. There's all bunch of stuff that needs to be thought of. Staging, should the terminal building stay there? There's a lot of pieces. So outside of sea level and storms and things like that, there's a lot of other parts that have to be plugged into this. And I think that the project that we're all seeing every day now is sort of really important to work from that point forward. The stuff that Chuck is talking about, Easy Street, it used to cave in. It used to be two-way, and there was a wooden bulkhead that people don't even realize that bulkhead that got replaced was not even sheet pile. That was wood. Crazy. It was undermined, and then when they reversed that to one way, kept the heavy trucks from driving the other direction. So I think that the downtown raising the streets and some of these other things, as far as the flappers and stuff, you look over there, they're not stainless steel. That's a whole important component that engineers and the materials that they use have to be, you know, fitted correctly so that this doesn't happen where the weight of the water is pushing up through the street because the street is lower than the outfall. So, I mean, that's pretty obvious that that's happening. But at the same time, I think that this process is going to change as a result, Mary, of this group, the resiliency plan, the land bank work. And I think that the steamship pier, you know, the steamship rebuilding process will be better for that. You know, it'll be a more of a joint, I don't know, I want to say that, but you know what I mean? Like there'll be more components involved now than there would have been, you know, say 10 years ago, if it suddenly got rebuilt then. I think Bob's points, that some of the things that he's talking about with Woods Hole, the bottom of the building is essentially like a submarine. It's going to be like a door with watertight. I mean, whether that'll ever be needed or not is another discussion, but like that's what's going to end up happening with some of these codes and stuff, with stuff along the waterfront, you know. So anyway, for public use, I mean, so that's all I have. I mean, but I'm looking at this holistically as we're going to be doing this at some point, and I think that there'll be, you know, everything will be taken into consideration now versus say 10 years ago. So thank you for having us, Mary.
Thank you, all three of you, for being here. And I appreciate in a macabre sort of way that Woods Hole gets to go first, and then that the lessons you're learning there will help us on Nantucket.
Yeah.
One of the things that I just wanted to bring up, perhaps a little bit outside our purview, we're not only seeing increase in flooding or higher storm heights, but we're seeing, you know, a wider variety of weather with climate change. And at your last steamship board meeting, there was, for instance, the example of ice forming in a way that hadn't formed before and causing an issue with the transfer bridges. And I know that you're planning to rebuild the transfer bridges on Nantucket, and I hope that you will also, you know, apply lessons and anticipate future problems due to more extreme weather as you're doing that here on the island.
Yeah, that's a good point. And yes, the plan is to be replacing those transfer bridges, and we'll be looking at the sheaves that the wiring goes through, so to make sure that we minimize potential problems. So, but I think in terms of the rotation, you know, at this point the Woods Hole project ended up being the last of the 5 terminals that was rebuilt. So Nantucket ends up coming around again, and you know, this is something that, you know, as we go forward, this is going to be stretching our resources. You know, the Woods Hole project is bigger than the Nantucket one, but the Nantucket's going to have a whole bunch of its own issues in terms of you know, you're 30 miles out to sea, and you know, in terms of staffing a project and how we're able to rebuild that facility, and you know, consideration of you know, storms and things like that. So.
Well, thank you, Bob. It's good to know that you're thinking ahead at the Steamship Authority. Are there other questions or comments from committee members? And if not, we'll go to Fritz. Go ahead.
Excuse me. A question to Bob, if I may. I realize this is difficult, but just for a frame of reference, so we have some basic understanding. Is there any, at this point, projected date as of which work in the Nantucket terminal might commence? I mean, is it 1 year, 5 years, 10 years?
Yeah, we're putting together a 10-year capital budget, and in it looks like probably in a 3 to 4 year frame, we'd be looking at starting the the engineering and feasibility of a portion of the project, knowing how long it took for some of these other projects. I would anticipate that would be 18 to 24 months, and then at that point be at a position to be doing work. So we're probably in the 5 to 6 year timeframe.
Thank you.
And that also would coincide with the completion of the Woods Hole terminal project as well. So,
Gary?
Yes, with respect to the projections of the rising tides over the next 9 years or 8 years now, or 2022, do the current steamship facilities that are in effect now, that are being used now, are they capable today and for the next 5 or 6 years of being able to continue being operative with the projections of rising tide that we have determined from Noaa and through this study? Is there enough flexibility today so that 3 or 4 years from now, we won't say, uh-oh, we can't get people off the ferry on days when there's a high tide?
yeah. So in terms of the Nantucket facility, obviously, I think the experience that we've had is that ends up being, the terminal itself ends up being one of the entrances to the terminal end up flooding before our terminal itself does. But obviously, it's going to be, if Mr. Larson's projections hold up, or the Noaa projections hold up, then obviously that's going to be become even more of an issue over the next 5 to 10 years. It's not unlike what we're experiencing over at our Vineyard Haven terminal as well. The main intersection there at Five Corners, that floods on numerous occasions, and they have to reroute traffic to get to our facility. So, they likewise are looking at what they can do to, I think, for some resiliency over there as well. So, I think our Hyannis Terminal, Mary had brought that up earlier about the Hyannis Terminal. The biggest issue we have in the Hyannis Terminal is actually the harbor filling in with sediment, and trying to, we've been asking for the Corps of Engineers to schedule a dredging project over there, because we're actually at a couple tide conditions where we have the boats, shall I say, are sniffing the bottom as they approach. And you may recall 6 or 7 years ago, we had to adjust the schedule to correspond with the tide cycle to be able to get a boat into the harbor and then out of the harbor before the tide went away. So we have to look at all aspects. It does no good to do a project in Nantucket if we can't get out of Hyannis. So we have to keep that in consideration.
Bob, has there been any thought, Nat mentioned an additional slip or partial slip, and I wondered, has there been any even preliminary examination of additional facilities for Nantucket? That something that has come up in the hazard mitigation plan, for instance, that, the danger that Nat mentioned, that if there is a grounding or other obstruction, that we lose all access having only one facility.
Yeah. I know it was probably 6, 7 years ago, and I'd have to go back and try to see if it had gone, how far it had gone. But there was some conceptual thoughts of what we would be doing over the Nantucket terminal, and they were very preliminary in terms of whether the terminal building itself would have to be repositioned. We have that area over by where the Skipper restaurant used to be. Unfortunately, we let that area, the pilings in that, we never addressed. So therefore, we'd have to go through the Chapter 91 for that whole region as well. Nat mentioned a barge dock. The fact that the barges end up coming in and they're on the face of the dock, it has caused some operational issues, and now that actually there's we preparing for documents study and sampling for a dredge application for the area. Takes quite a while to get that process done. So, I think, conceptually it was going to be, like a 2.5 type slip type scenario, but whether that's ends up being the preferred outcome, I think it'd be premature at this point to say so. But obviously our vessels require deeper water than the high, the steel vessels require deeper water than what our high speed does, and likewise high lines, high speed. So being able to separate that service maybe something that should be looked at as well.
Thank you. Further questions from committee members? Joanna?
Hi there. Sorry, I had to unmute. Hi, Bob. I'm just wondering about, similar to some of the questions that some of the other folks have asked, if you're looking 10 years out, right? And if you're looking 20 years out, what do you think are the 3 most important things that the Steamship Authority has to do to mitigate this? And what's the plan to do that?
Okay. Well, I can tell you in terms of, with the Woods Hole project, for instance, the design there is done in such a manner that we address the immediate sea level rise issue, but it's designed in a manner in which we're capable of raising the bulkhead another 4 to 6 feet. If we find 25 years down the line that the sea level rise is causing more of an issue. Just like Nantucket is not to the extent, but Woods Hole community itself is looking at a resiliency project because we may end up being the high point in the village, but it will have the infiltration from the village coming onto our property as well. So kind of like with Easy Street, we need to be looking at that aspect of it. So so I think it would be something that we'd be looking for the engineers to be coming up with a design that's adaptable as conditions change. So.
Thank you, Bob.
Mary, can I add something?
Yes, and then we'll go back to
I just want to add to what Joanna said. I just thought of something that popped into my head. And Chuck has probably already noticed all these things as he travels around. The peninsula sort of effect is what I kind of call it, like what Bob mentioned about Woods Hole. So think about all these houses that are being built between 7 and 10 feet higher than everybody else, or any existing place prior to the FEMA map. Those houses can be accessed normal because they've raised the property around it. They've designed it that way. But that's not a floating structure. There's not boats pulling up along the side of a house, okay? Well, yeah, I guess. But in the steamship, I mean, it's sort of like the docks. All the work that's going on in the marina, they're not raising anything. It's getting rebuilt exactly the same height as it was. And I'm assuming that the reason for that is because if they make it too high, people won't be able to access their boat in their low tide or some other thing, lines. It would affect how the boats are tied up and how people access them. I'm assuming that that's part of it. So what Bob said is key about designing bulkheads to be added on, not just to be blown up and started from scratch again. And again, like I use this term a lot with different projects and things, is that the final job or the last time we do something like the police station is never going to be replaced. I mean, at some point in time, the way we talk about this, we're going to end up having to have an evacuation plan, Mary. So I think that the design of the steamship dock is going to definitely be not just higher for for current use, but the ability to add. My hope is that the sheet pile and the stuff that they did in Woods Hole, just so you know, I'm nuts about corrosion, and they put galvanized tiebacks in, and they go out into the middle of the lot and they tie into the ground somehow. That's never going to have to be replaced. I mean, the way they're doing that stuff now, it's crazy. Pouring concrete in the middle of the pilings, it's unbelievable. So we don't have that here on the current dock. So it's more about the resilience of the lasting effect of the project, and being able to add to the bulkhead and replace the bulkhead without having to redo everything else. I think that that's the most important piece for this committee and anyone else interested in this, to know that that's how things are going to end up being built. It's not like we're going to build it 10 feet high for now. It's going to be higher, but there's going to be a way to make it higher at a future time, because we're not moving somewhere else. You know what I mean? Like, where are we going to go? Dionys? I mean, it's just, I think that that issue is extremely complicated. If we had Bob can attest to this, but when did the Oak Bluffs terminal get built, Bob? When was that? Has that been there since day one?
No, it was rebuilt in 2007 through 2010.
No, I mean, how long has that terminal existed as a port? Like 50 years, 75?
Yes, so it goes back, actually. I think it goes back even farther than that, because there used to be a rail line that went from Oak Bluffs to Edgartown.
Yep. So when you look at, Mary, you and I talked about this recently. When you look at Oak Bluffs, it's sort of like, a tradition. It's not so much that, we have two slips in Hyannis, two docks in the Vineyard just because it was the right thing. It was just happened to happen that way. And now it's a treasured thing that'll never go away, no matter how crazy it is in the middle of the ocean like that. So, they can't operate in the winter, and there's, but it's a cute little place in the summertime. And that's just because it was there. So, Nantucket has one because of the design and how the jetties were put in and the channel, and it's sort of a one access sort of place. So I think that things will come together, and it will be a good, well vetted project like Woods Hole, but a smaller version. So that's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Nat. Joanna, did you have a follow-up?
Yep, thank you, Nat. That was helpful. So Bob, essentially this project that's going to happen here in terms of shoring up the Steamship Authority, and I like Nat's explanation of the construction process being more resilient and being added onto. What is the timeline for this? Is it 5 years? Is it 10 years? Is it 20 years? What is that?
Yeah, so we have another four plus years of the Woods Hole terminal being redone because of the site work that needs to take place in the two buildings. So the capital budget that we'll be presenting in February for the board's approval will include, in the 10-year, a feasibility study, probably year 3 or 4. I don't have it in front of me, so I forget which year we slotted that in terms of availability of funds. With the idea being is to be probably 18 months to 24 months of work there, which then would put it 5 to 6 years out before we'd be looking for physical construction. But all during those phases, there'll be opportunity for public comment and working with the community, working with the town in terms of what they see as the needs for the facility as well. And so there'll be ample opportunity to work together on that. So.
Mary, can I have one more question? So that's probably 5 to 6 years out. And are you at all thinking about, all the things that Chuck just described, right? The number of days that this is going to be beyond a reasonable flood and how that may impact the island, because, essentially, this is critical to our infrastructure. And so if we're waiting 6 years, then construction, right? And all of that, because how many years are you on the Woods Hole project? If you're saying there's 4 more years left?
Yeah, the Woods Hole project was a different project in that it involved a pier that we had to remove in order to rebuild the 3 slips. The terminal building itself, it has been delayed because of COVID, and we've been dealing with some of those issues. So if we're looking at there's passenger piers as well in the Woods Hole facility, as opposed to the footprint that we have for Nantucket. So I wouldn't anticipate it to be as lengthy as a process that we have for Woods Hole. Probably more in line with what we experienced with the Hyannis Terminal when we rebuilt that in the Vineyard Haven Terminal. So it'd be probably a 3 or 4, because we need to limit the work to the off season because of the amount of pedestrians that we have coming through as well. So
right. So basically, we're looking at a 10-year timeline for the Steamship Authority to have major improvements on a plan where we're identifying the 10-year mark as a critical mark.
Yep.
Okay, I just wanted that to be clear. Thank you.
Thank you, Joanna. I know I plan to check the tide charts before I make a steamship reservation, because I drive a little Fiat 500 and water is not a good thing for that car. So I want to make sure that we have time for some of the remaining events on the agenda. So I want to pause here. Are there other members of the public in attendance who have questions or comments on the topics we've presented so far? And if you just want to go ahead and unmute and identify yourself, that will be fine. Right, I am not seeing any. So again, I'm going to request a little indulgence for jumbling the agenda. Because we do have the Steamship Authority representatives, I wanted to mention the Harbor's Action Plan update. Vince, if you can put that up on the screen. This is not something that the Coastal Resilience Advisory Committee is directly involved in, but it is certainly something that is of interest to us and potentially other members who are in attendance today. The town has issued an RFP for an update to the Harbor's Action Plan. And Vince, if you want to just briefly scroll through that. The 2009 was the date of the last plan. So just letting people know, this is a document available on the town's website. We will put a link in the minutes to that. And this is something that is underway for anybody who is interested in looking at that RFP. That is something that is requested to coordinate with the Coastal Resilience Plan. Any questions or comments? Peter, I didn't know if you had any comment from the Harbor and Shellfish Advisory Board on the update for the plan? No? Okay. All right, so I just wanted to make sure that announcement was included. We will move forward. That the Steamship Authority representatives, again, thank you for attending today. You certainly don't need to attend for the rest of the meeting, but you're welcome to if you want to.
thanks for having us.
Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you very much, Mary.
Thank
Talk
you.
to you.
Vince, you want to stop sharing? Further announcement, the Envision Resilience Nantucket Challenge Survey 2. This is the follow-up survey to the survey they did a year ago. They did invite the Coastal Resilience Advisory Committee to submit some questions, and we thank them for including those. So our logo is shown as a sponsor of the survey. That survey link is in the agenda for anyone who hasn't taken that yet. The survey is open until February 1st. And the goal of the survey is to see if attitudes on Nantucket have changed in any way from a year ago after the delivery of the Coastal Resilience Plan and many of the other events that happened this past year, including the Envision Resilience Nantucket Challenge. All right, is there any other public comment for items not on the agenda at this time? Again, just go ahead and unmute yourself and let us know. I'm not hearing anybody. So we move on to other new business and committee and natural resources department reports. And we have an update from Vince Murphy and Morgan Sale in the resources department about the recent storm impacts for flooding and erosion.
Hi, everyone. I'm just going to do a quick intro. Hopefully everyone can see this, put it in presentation mode. Is this in full screen now, Mary?
Yes.
Thank you. So Friday through Monday, we had quite a lot of activity. I'm going to focus on Monday more than anything, and for a reason, while Rob Ranney and Bob are still around, hopefully. I don't know if Bob is still here. Anyway, he can see it in the recording and Rob can tell him about it. So I, first of all, have to, I feel like I should apologize to the committee. I've been giving presentations over the last few years, and I've been putting basic facts on a screen. Morgan has come to join me in this office now as the Coast Resources technician, and she has brought a wonderfully artful flair, and hopefully we can continue this going forward, because she has made what I had started out as a basic presentation into something beautiful. So I'm just going to go through the flooding portion of this, mainly for Monday, and I'm glad Chuck is still here for this bit because I observed an unusual effect. Then later, the second half of the presentation, or it'll be more than second half, the later portion of it, Morgan is going to talk about erosion, mainly on the South Shore, and a new erosion monitoring project that we have started. Okay, so on Monday, I had a look at the flooding that as it was on Easy Street at high tide. I was checking other places earlier in the day, and I didn't check Easy Street during the peak of the storm, which is around 9 o'clock. So I also went back and checked the Noaa rainfall recordings for this day, for the whole of the 17th, and it was 1.01 inches of precipitation as it was measured at Nantucket Memorial Airport, so about 2 miles south, for the sake of argument. But if we just imagine that that amount of rainfall fell in the downtown area, this is the resulting effect as it was at high tide, about 2 hours after the peak of the storm. So when I was walking around, I saw these higher tide lines around the place. This is on the newly developed land bank property. This is only the first example of it. There was examples further up Oak Street too. And I have an example on the next slide. But as I was walking around, high tide was at 10:40. I was there from a few minutes before to a good few minutes after high tide, just so that everyone understands the time frame that I'm dealing with here. And that obviously during the storm, it seems like the water level was higher for a time. This is also observed at the bottom of Broad Street. There seems to be two tide lines that are somewhat visible here. This whole area had been closed to vehicle traffic, so I'm reasonably confident that this wasn't caused by a vehicle splash that would have forced these two tide lines into where they are now. And the fact that it was on land bank property that had been closed for the entirety of the flood as well. So then I had a look over the wall at Easy Street to see where the flooding was and how the water was flowing through the duckbills. So this is at high tide, and the water pressure was such that on the positive side, water was still forcing its way down through the duckbills, and there was outflow, so there was positive pressure on the up gradient side to allow that to happen. So the duckbills did work. From that, I can attempt to infer that this is all freshwater flooding from upstream areas. Now, I also have to say it openly and quite loudly, I didn't have a salinity meter, so I couldn't take a sample on the spot, or any cup or anything like that I could take samples from. I've done that in the past, where I've taken samples, used a salinity meter to see the amount of salt in it, and if it's above a certain level, then you can, or you can say that it's largely or mostly harbor water. But from what I observed, it seemed to me that this was mainly a freshwater flooding event. The duckbills were working adequately that time, and they were working as designed, I would say. So the next portion of the presentation is from Morgan. I'm going to stop sharing. Do you want to share, Morgan?
Yes, let's see if I can figure this out.
Looks good.
Okay. Okay, perfect. Yeah, so as you all are aware, we had a good bit of weather recently. We noticed that most of the impacts from the wind tended to be on the south shore, generally from about the mid-island area going westward towards Nantucket. It was kind of interesting because the storm started out with wind coming from the north, and then we had a little bit of calm on Sunday, and then it all started coming from the south and southwest. So that was interesting. Here are some fun photos of Nantucket that you may have seen in the paper recently. You can see on the left, there's the fence post back there and the signs, and then on the right, those are all pretty much completely gone. I think Vince and I estimated that these fence posts are about 8 feet long. So that gives you a pretty good idea of how much we may have lost. And then obviously there's a pretty solid drop off right there. Here is another view looking west towards Smith's Point. You can see pretty much the same thing here. Their brand new snow fencing that they installed is now not brand new anymore. Then I would just like to talk a little bit about our new erosion monitoring stations. We've picked a few locations on the South Shore. We picked the end of Nonantum Avenue, kind of the general vicinity of the town sewer beds, and then in Tom Nevers Field to put a few measuring points in so that we can consistently measure from the bank to see if we've lost any ground. We've been trying to do this about once a month whenever we can, or after really strong storms like we experienced recently. Most of the stakes are placed at 20-foot intervals. A few of them are a little longer to kind of avoid being run over if they're in the middle of a road. And the biggest changes we noticed were at the sewer beds. So that's what we're going to kind of focus on. This is a map of our stations at the sewer beds. We picked 3 locations at the end. One is at the end of Western Ave, which is formerly a vehicle access point. We picked another one that is in line with the fencing, kind of at the midpoint, and then the third point is at the end, which is also in line with the fencing. This is at station SA, which stands for Sewer A. We got some pretty good drone pictures early December that gave us a pretty accurate idea of what the bank looks like, but these bank lines are extremely rough estimates. SA, I think, lost about 10 feet. The other stations are kind of there just in case we do lose a post, we kind of know where we were. So you can see that the edge of the bluff has changed quite a bit over the course of the weekend. Here is just a little table showing the change that we noticed. We hadn't lost anything over the course of the month up until presumably this weekend or previous weekends. On the 18th, when we remeasured, we noticed that there was 10 feet less. Here is an overview of SB, which we found experienced the greatest amount of loss. SB lost 4 feet, I think a few days before this storm happened, and then lost about 18 feet after the storm happened. So again, very, very rough approximation of the bluff line, but that's about what it looks like. Here is a table showing our data. At the time of installation of these posts, the distance from the bank to the edge of the fence at the sewer beds was about 135 feet. At the time of remeasuring, we measured about 113 feet, and we've since heard from the people at the sewer department that we've actually lost SB2 as well. So the amount of loss is probably even greater than that. And lastly, we have SC. Again, very, very, very rough estimate of where the bluff is. I believe we lost about 12 feet here. I'm not sure on the exact distance from the bluff to the edge of the fence here. I believe it's a little bit more than at station SB, but that's what that looks like. And again, we have our table showing we lost about 12 feet. There's a greater distance between SC2 and SC3 here because there's a big road that runs through the middle of it and we didn't want it to get run over. That is about it. We are hoping to put in a few more of these little measuring spots so that we get kind of a clearer idea on how these areas change. Hopefully we'll be able to put one in near the airport soon and pick a couple other few key spots, but that's what this storm looked like. So there you have it.
Thank you, Morgan. Vince, do you have anything to add perhaps about conversations with the sewer department?
Yep, so the sewer department have some data as well on this kind of stuff. They have a different monitoring station and we're hopefully going to combine them at some point in the future. We're still working on that. And we're also looking at any potential for cooperation and seeing if we can't fulfill one of the goals from the CRP about the sewer, the sewer bed protections. In the CRP, it's suggested that there should be an artificial dune system or beach nourishment in that area to reduce the erosion in that area. And this actually, just so everyone knows, most people do, this used to be an active accretion zone. That has changed majorly in the last couple of years, short term, no matter which way you cut it. So this is an active and pretty major erosion zone. So I think that some people in the sewer department, David Gray, the director, has been in contact with engineers to try and do an assessment of what might be done in that area. That's something that we could then, from this committee's point of view, assist with and potentially use to check off that one recommendation from the CRP. So there's kind of a 2 or 3 levels to this for the committee, but also to be actively involved in the monitoring and keep this committee up to date with that and make that publicly known, and look at resilience methods that might be implemented either by another set of engineers or in cooperation with the CRP recommendation.
Thank you, Vince. Questions or comments from committee members? Fritz?
I would just note, I frequently walk on the beach between the Austin Lock beach access and what would be Cisco Beach, the public beach. And what I've been observing and observes even more so is about 100 yards east of the town beach, about halfway in between. There is a dune covered with grass and other growth that's been fairly high. And the significance is it's the high point, because once you breach that dune, it's all downhill to the houses on Cisco. And what I've noticed, and particularly the other day when I was walking, is all of that, the dune grass, the grass and the other vegetation on that dune bluff, on that bluff, is now covered with sand. And the sand goes back probably 10 feet beyond what was the high point. So I don't know whether you've been watching that, but I've kind of been watching it because it seems to me that if that dune goes or is breached, that whole area, lowland area that's back 50, 100 feet from the bluff could at times be filled with water.
So Austin Lock and the surrounding land to the east is for the vast majority land bank property. Then we start to come into the interface of private properties as we move west.
Yeah.
I'm interested in that area partly because of its wonderful bass fishing potential. So that's how I know that more than anywhere else. And I saw that washover fan when I was scouting it last weekend. So that's what the sand filling in there. That's a washover fan, that the sand deposition in that area indicates it. There's also flow lines that kind of show where water went back into that area. So I kind of know it fairly well. The road that parallels it going towards, parallels the beach going towards Cisco, I think that's called Caroline Way or Carolina Way. That's another place where there's houses that I'm concerned about. So yes, when we've been selecting places to do these measurements so far, we had places like Tom Nevers because there was a potential for park redevelopment in that area, and we wanted information ahead of time. Nantucket, where there's a point in the road that might be hit by erosion at some point in the future. So we wanted information on that, and that wasn't on town property, and it was land bank property in front of it. So we sought land bank permission to put in a station there. And then sewer beds was pretty easy because that is town property, and there's a pretty major concern. And as Morgan already said, the next place we're looking at is the airport to try and collect data there. If we can find, so we're looking at high risk places where there's a population that might be affected. So the area in Caroline Way, if we can find somewhere to put in a station on either private property with permission or land bank property with permission, or a piece of town property where there might be a paper road or something to that effect, that's the kind of thing that I would look for there to put in a monitoring station. But for the most part, as we head east and west of that area, it's conservation lands, and the erosion rate would be nice to know there, but it's not as critical because there aren't the kind of services that we have, say, at the airport, sewer beds, Nantucket Road, and other places. We're trying to also see if we can establish some out in Nantucket as well, so that we can have measurements in that area too. But yeah, I appreciate that, Fritz.
So Vince, it might be a good idea to Fritz's point to, when you're putting in those monitoring stakes, to mark the ground level on the stake so that we can see whether or not sand is accumulating or being blown or washed away, on the land, and not just on the bluff face or the beachfront. I think it'd be instructive to know what's going on from a vertical perspective for the inland.
Sure. Just to say that as much as I like that idea, we could also lose those stakes to erosion, but we could also lose them to be completely buried, and then we wouldn't have any idea. So that's what happened at Millie's Bridge in 2017. There was about 6+ feet in some places of sand deposited, and any stake that were in a place like that would have been long gone. We'd have lost it.
Fritz?
I just anecdotally note that I kind of have my own monitoring station there. The house that as you go west from Austin Lock Way, there's that one house that's sort of right on the beach, the only house in that area until you get down to the Rayleigh Shack. My monitoring stations are 2 sprinkler heads that are about 4 feet back from the bluff. So anyway.
Provided it's not private property and you have the ability to measure it in some even anecdotal way that would cause an issue, I'll take any data, please.
Well, I can stand on the bluff and kind of take a, down on the sand and the beach and actually take a, probably measure it with a yardstick. Right? It's that close.
Thank you, Fritz. Other comments, Gary?
Just a question. Was the erosion that was so severe at where the sewer beds were, did that continue on further around, all the way around to the bluff, to Sconset Bluff and stuff? Or was it just really near the sewer beds where the most erosion occurred?
From the data that we've been trying to collect and look at, it looks like what's it called? Tom Nevers was largely unaffected in this most recent storm. So it was localized and episodic, like most of our erosion here in Nantucket. Also, somewhat anecdotal information, because I didn't check it. Maybe Morgan has better information than I do. The sand in the front of the Baxter Road template, it did get washed away, but that did what it was supposed to do. So it was uneven, as it always is. But I also should point out, David Bray made a very interesting observation when we were chatting about the erosion. Over the last couple of years, there's been a lot more intense storms with south and southwest components that have increased the erosion rate around the sewer beds. So I'm curious if there's some greater climactic effect that we just don't know about or have yet to understand. But that's anecdotal as at the moment. And you start with anecdotal evidence before you turn it into real evidence. So that's something worth studying.
Thank you, Vince. Rob Rennie?
Putting on my assessor's hat, years ago I did some studies out in the Nantucket area where I looked at where the current shoreline is and what on land court plans it was 100 years ago, and where Nantucket Road ends now, it went out about another 1/4 mile from where it is now 100 years ago. So you could timeline it back. And, it was a rough average then, about 10 to 12 feet a year, which seemed to hold true. Some years are less, some years are more, but the averages, are there to look at.
Yeah. If I might, Mary.
Yes, go ahead, Vince.
So we have state level data that shows, say in the Nantucket area, depending where you are in the Nantucket area, there's between 8 and 9 feet up to 12 feet on Smith's Point of erosion per year. But again, it's episodic. An area could be stable for 3 years and then lose 30 feet. And I'm afraid that's what we've seen at the sewer beds. So the state level data is based on observations that started in 1844 and were updated at non-specific intervals. Sometimes there's only 10 years between an interval where it might be updated. Other times there's 30 and 40 years between an interval when it's updated. But I think we have 7 intervals in that. So yeah, that's how the erosion rate is calculated, using the same idea.
Thank you, Vince. Further comments or questions from members of the committee or members of the public in attendance?
Mary?
Yes, Deanne, go ahead.
Yes, I have a question about erosion in front of the sewer beds, both in Surfside and Sconset. It's our understanding that DEP has mandated that we have relocation plans in place should erosion get too close to certain triggers. And the town manager and the sewer director referenced this last week at the select board meeting. And it might be informative for CRAC to put on its agenda what those DEP relocation plans are for both the sewer beds in Surfside and Sconset, and what the triggers are.
Thank you, Deanne. That is actually in our queue, so stay tuned.
Excellent. Thank you, Mary.
Other comments or questions? All right, seeing none. So we can finally move on to the neglected minutes. Vince, if you want to put those up on the screen.
Okay, everyone seeing this?
Yes.
Do you want me to go over the amendments, Mary?
Yes, please.
2 minor ones. There's the standing one, which is to include recording of the presentation. And there's one down here where I added my presentation from 2 weeks ago to the Coastal Resilience Library, and here's a link for it. And I reworded the language appropriately for that.
Okay. Any other comments or corrections to the minutes? If none, we'll take a motion to approve.
So moved.
Thank you, Matt. Do we have a second?
Second.
Thank you, Gary. Any further discussion? If not, we'll do a roll call vote. Gary Beller,
Aye.
Peter Brace,
Aye.
Matt Fee,
Aye.
Ian Golding,
Aye.
Fritz McClure,
Aye.
Joanna Roach,
Aye.
and Mary Longacre, aye. Those are adopted. Any further reports from committees? If there are none, just a reminder that our upcoming meetings will continue to be virtual through April 1st, and we're waiting to hear if there will be any extension of that granted from the state government. And our meetings, let's see, our next meeting would be February 8th. So if there's nothing else, we'll take a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Thank you, Matt. Do we have a second?
Second.
Joanna, roll call vote. Gary Beller,
Aye.
Peter Brace,
Aye.
Matt Fee,
Aye.
Ian Golding. Ian, we did.
Sorry about that. Aye.
Fritz McClure,
Aye.
Joanna Roach,
Aye.
and Mary Longacre, aye. Thank you all for attending. We'll see you in a couple of weeks.